Yes, yes. Welcome to the ancient world of tabletop games. I am Agamemnon, from the historical documentary Time Bandits. This is a report from a fugitive. What is a choose-your-own-adventure book? It's a brand. This boxed set takes the format and turns it into a board game using cards instead of book pages. But what is it generally? Better perhaps to call it a choose-your-own-path story or a branching narrative. The branching narrative is familiar from computer games written with multiple endings in mind. Think of Star Wars games in which you play the heroic character who has the option to turn evil through choices you make throughout the story. When I say choices, I mean menu selections. A branching storybook feels as though it should have been invented by a family of Bronte-ish sisters, minus the bleak moors, trapped in a Victorian parlour, whiling away the hours as sulphurous fog rolls by down an old London town. We have no evidence for this, and must turn to the 20th century for the publishing debut of the multipath tale As Game. Consider the Consequences is a book by Doris Webster and Mary Alden Hopkins from 1930. The reader is offered different consequences of actions based on turning to particular numbered paragraphs. If you want to ask Jack to paint you like one of his French girls, turn to paragraph H22. Will you share the life raft with Jack by turning to paragraph H69? Or are you determined to keep the raft to yourself by turning to paragraph HB1TCHY? You get the idea. The branching narrative depends on numbered paragraphs, and book pages usually reflect this. Often, instead of page numbers, the pages list clusters of paragraphs. That quick reference mechanism makes the reading experience easier to navigate in the case of the paper book. Hyperlinks serve the same function in digital works, though needn't rely on numbers at all. Your basic branching narrative tells a story, the end. It is up to the writer to go in and add side stories, possible surprise dead-end versions earlier in the tale, and multiple endings based on actions taken from around the midpoint of the narrative onwards. We're here to consider the gamebook versions. I first encountered the branching narrative tale in the science fiction section of the library. This strange book was lumped in with all the usual strange books. Mission to Planet L by Kenneth James and John Allen. In my video on buying board games, I warn against paying 10 times what a game is worth. I see this book was 30p in 1973 money. For video research, I picked it up for a little over £3. Checking the online inflation adjuster, I found I paid less for this book now than anyone paid for it in 1973, allowing for the passage of time. It was mint in 1973, though. Sadly, it looks as though I bought the last cheap copy. Really, Internet? Really? Right there on the cover, this book asks if you would like to go on an adventure. Webster and Hopkins treated Consider the Consequences as a game. The Choose Your Own Adventure series is also a game of sorts. You are the star of the story in the sense that game books are written like cookery books or travel brochures. Thoroughly mash your potatoes. Now you enter the next phase of cooking. When you arrive in scenic Dubrovnik, you will be met by our cultural guide. You walk into our day room and encounter a table groaning under the weight of delicious pastries. Game books are written in the second person. You know. Thoroughly mash your orcish foes. Now you enter the next phase of adventure. When you arrive in scenic Dubrovnik, you will be met by our cultural guide. To talk culture, turn to 359. To arrange a smuggling deal on the sly, wiggle your eyebrows and turn to 224. You walk into the day room and encounter a table groaning under the weight of delicious pastries, guarded by 3 spearmen and an ogre berserker. Fight. Yes, you are the hero. It is all about you. You walk into the scene. You are told what your character perceives, what your character encounters, what your character feels. Then you, as the reader, have a choice thrust into your face. Go this way or that way, do this thing or that thing, and you hunt out the next numbered paragraph. In branching narrative books, you'll almost certainly find your way to an ending, barring writerly shenanigans and infinite loops. There is replayability. Play that Star Wars computer game again and go for the evil ending this time. If you do that, you'll see how similar the experience is a second time around, and you'll encounter the differences. Same thing with a game book. The experience will be similar in a broad sense, plot unchanged, narrowing to a different ending through alterations in your paragraph choices. I'm with Dorothy Parker. Brevity is the soul of lingerie. Mission to Planet L gives you a brief taste of the branching narrative, and you'll see rapidly the various endings on offer. One thing you don't get in that book is the second-person viewpoint. James and Alan offer a hint of the you story on that front cover, but the trend washes away inside. To help the reader identify with the main character, this planetary mission is an I story. The first thing that leaps to mind is the work of Raymond Chandler or Dashiell Hammett. The detective tells the story and you see what he sees. A first-person private eye branching narrative certainly appeals. We're in the realm of science fiction here, though, and still in the relative infancy of the game book. Mission predates the Choose-Your-Own-Adventure brand by over half a decade and doesn't give the reader much to chew over. At that point, there wasn't even a published version of Dungeons & Dragons to fuel the branching narrative. A year later, D&D would slowly start to change everything. The story is in text on the left-hand pages and carries illustrations on the right, with numbered choices built into the pictures. Page numbers only appear on the right for ease of use. There are multiple endings, all of which are buried inside the second half of the book. No ending actually finishes the book on the last page. Entry 40 redirects the reader to page 24. This is an important point in illustrated branching narratives. There's nothing to stop a writer burying the end of the book at paragraph 10, but if it comes with an illustration showing ultimate victory, then the reader may easily unwittingly catch a glimpse of a spoiler paragraph at the opening of the experience. The e-book, a heavily hyperlinked Kindle story, does away with the accidental page-turning glimpses. Mission suffers mildly in this regard, as you must pass illustrations with no numbers on them to reach text further in. It's clear that numberless illustrations conclude the adventure, with nowhere left to turn to. That book offers narrative success or vague failure with a bit of hope and unanswered questions as the final story. There is another type of end to a game book, however, and that is death by combat. Sudden death through a surprise, unscripted terminal finish, and not necessarily close to the end of a lengthy reading experience. What game books needed was actual game. Games Workshop founders Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone provided that with a fighting fantasy game book in which you become the hero. The reading experience was no longer just about reading and choosing paragraphs. A decade on from Mission to Planet L, the Warlock of Firetop Mountains soaked up the atmosphere from intermittent releases of fantasy movies, though feasted primarily on the boost from the rise of Dungeons & Dragons, which Jackson and Livingstone had distributed through their company Games Workshop. Settings in the Fighting Fantasy series include the usual fantasy worlds, science fiction sagas, horror tales, and the illustrated format went a long way to boosting the popularity of these books. The audience was there. The writers only had to add dice. Mission to Planet L is positively threadbare with its 40 numbered sections next to the fighting fantasy formula of 400 story slices. Firetop Mountain ends at the very end on the number 400, though coyly conceals the final illustration and text piece behind a turn of the page. There are no page numbers, merely paragraph guides, 134 to 137, and so on. Players are left to ferret out the story by themselves. Role-playing game trappings aren't far away. You are the hero, with a character sheet and equipment list. Yes, you even roll up a character using 6-sided dice. The game element is simple enough. For combat, roll 2 dice and add to your skill value. Then roll for the enemy. High roller wins and the loser takes damage to a stamina score. Some fights are avoidable. Once you're in combat, it's kill or be killed, though advanced options exist to run away from battle from time to time. This dice-based combat adds an element of instant death to the narrative. You chose a course of action that may well have been unavoidable. You were always going to fight that monster. The story said so, no matter the paragraph chosen, and then you died as the creature was simply better at fighting, rolling dice, than you were. Enter replayability. Make new choices. Don't go that way. Avoid the fight if you can, then discover you can't. Or pick up extra equipment before the fight, dodge the many small hindrances on the way to the fight, and roll better dice results when the time comes. Manage the slender list of resources at your disposal. There's the gameplay. Another title, Steve Jackson's Sorcery, added a magic system relying on numbered paragraphs for special effects. If you read the separate spellbook at night when there was an R in the month and a Y in the day of the week, you could summon actual demons to do your bidding, and that is a gamebook fact, unless you turn to 103 to disbelieve a patent lie. Sorcery also added pictures of dice to the books. You didn't even need dice. All you had to do was remember or note down the paragraph you were on, then turn the paperback into a flip book and stop randomly to learn the dice results. That opens the reader up to more accidental glimpses of key paragraphs as you shoot through the whole text, but this is a minor gripe. The series repeats plot-free illustrations throughout, adding a sense of theme without spoiling the story ahead of time. Turning to story, the more involved, detailed a branching narrative, the fewer branches there are. One formula is to write a novel, then break off into a few meaningful side choices. Rich history and character depth are provided at the expense of extensive gameplay options. This is true of the Endless Quest books, a line of spin-off stories based on assorted TSR role-playing games. Here the game is D&D. No game system appears in these books. They use regular pages as the slices of story, with a few illustrations throughout. This volume has several endings, and one of those finishes the book at the very end of the page setup. Analysis of the paths in this story shows few choices, 2 main branches, and a crossover from one branch to another. The branches both spread out into clusters of endings. It's more likely that a detailed story has a specific character in mind as the star. In the case of fighting fantasy books, you are the hero, no need to pen chapters on your background, for you are you, shoved into the skin of an adventurer, a mighty magician, a starship captain, or what have you. You'll find male characters as these heroes with the Lone Wolf books by Joe Deaver, for example, though a blank canvas approach allows the reader to hide behind the word you as sole description in the fighting fantasy range. Employing gender-neutral fantasy fiction character names is another option for the writer. Male, female, neutral, you are you. The fighting fantasy books certainly emphasize the threat faced rather than the character facing the threat on the book covers, giving a first-person shooter or stabber feel to proceedings. Let's consider structure and branching narratives. First is the line that runs beginning, middle, end. The only branching narrative is provided by the reader at the end of a linear story, playing what if. Add to that the basic detour. Character travels across the land. You take the high road to town or the low road to town. No matter the choice, the character will still end up in town, barring sudden death and a fight along the way. Next, there's the major branch away from the narrative. Your character takes the low road into town. Okay, you still end up in town. There you have the option of misadventures in the saloon or a side trip to the outskirts where you'll explore an abandoned building. Both sections of the story are quite long and conclude with night falling. There are many paragraphs to work through, and the story is different in each branch. Ultimately, the 2 narratives lead to one paragraph that opens with sunrise and setting off on new adventures, chasing down clues in the wilds. This raises a point in designing the story. If the end of the story requires a piece of equipment for completion, picking up a clue that's a number added to another number obtained earlier, combined to give you a paragraph entry that you turn to when prompted, then these clues should be obtainable inside the main narrative. If they are shunted to one side branch that you don't explore, you automatically fail the game, even though you may be reading for quite some time before realization dawns on you. The game punishes you for failing, but doesn't tell you this until you fail later, encouraging exploration through replayability if you haven't thrown the book against the wall. There are nice ways to design the story and nasty ways to torture the reader, and there are readers who like to be tortured by writers who like to torture everyone. Beyond the minor detours and the moderate branches that rejoin the main story, there are major branches that never attempt a return. Those stout branches become the main story. You've made a major choice and must stick with it through to one of several variant endings. Inside that mix of options, there are yet more possibilities. The last chance detour that lets you cross over from one major branch to another. Also the possibility of entering a closed loop that works its way around to itself again. 101, to leave the room, head to 55. To enter the time portal, turn to 161. 161 then leads through an adventure in time and space that eventually deposits the character at an entry that says you find yourself in front of another time portal. Turn to 161, and from that point, you're caught in the time vortex for eternity. It's easy enough to change the details so you are running through an endless nightmare or a graveyard packed with zombies. Perhaps the loop is only an illusion with the same text each time, but running under fresh paragraph numbers so that eventually, with persistence, the reader escapes back to the main story. Again, hyperlinks remove the need for numbers in ebooks and can disguise the nature of loops more easily. Other options include impossible locations. There isn't a paragraph that leads to entry 371, but sharp-eyed readers, flicking from one page to the next, spot this sneaky hello from the writer, with the explanation that you can't reach this place from anywhere else. It opens up the possibility of interactivity across books. You discover an entry that reads, "If you have book 3 handy, turn to 371 in that volume. There you find instructions to continue the tale." The main reason for a paragraph that you can't reach from any other paragraph is clue-based. You find a key labelled 21 and another key labelled 105. You are urged to write the numbers on your equipment list. Further into the story, you discover a vault door with space for 2 keys. You are instructed to add numbers from any keys you found and turn to that paragraph. If the paragraph makes no sense, turn to 150 instead. At 126, you unlock the treasure. This may be a side quest to gain extra loot, after which you trek on, whether you had the keys or not. Evilly, this adding to find a paragraph might well be the only way to solve the adventure. The end. Branching narratives are as simple or complex as the writer wants them to be. There is a balancing act between complexity of linking paths and difficulty of any game elements thrown into the format. Fighting fantasy books stick to a winning format, tell a story, involve the reader in choices, illustrate the book, add a basic combat system, throw in a few rules for handling equipment and skills. Away you go, it's a real page-turner. What of the audience? These games are almost exclusively for one reader, though I've read these game books to people and I plan on reading them again on this channel. I'll narrate for a gamer with dyslexia. We'll see how that goes. The role-playing game, normally the province of the gaming group, occasionally dips its toe in the waters of single-reader play. Tunnels and Trolls is a game with a focus on solo adventuring reflected in its back catalogue of solitaire adventures. Cthulhu is a game built for the lone investigator, though few solo products are out there. These books still face the illustration problem, giving away plot points. They added a mechanism to each paragraph, the ability to backtrack to a previous entry by listing numerous paragraph numbers the reader could have used to reach the latest point. A handy mechanism if you lose your way through a momentary lack of concentration. It's best to call those books solitaire adventures. They require the games themselves to follow the rules of play. Branching narrative game books provide their own game systems in one volume. Fighting fantasy books emphasize this on the covers, and in the case of sorcery, you didn't even need dice. Why did the formula work? Tick off the boxes. Told a story, portable, inbuilt game system, simple game system explained within a dozen pages, and that included 2 pages devoted to the character sheet. All this in an era when a game like Advanced Dungeons & Dragons took up 3 rulebooks. Branching narrative stories appealed to gamers with a little time on their hands. Note the paragraph you are on, set the book down, come back to it later. Choose your own story, path, adventure, fight the fantasy, stand alone against the tentacles. The branching narrative, with game system or without, serves as a diverting read in which you choose the degree of diversion from the main tale. There's an added level of enjoyment, also known as misery, that comes from handing these books around the regular group of gamers and comparing exploits to see if that monster slimed you or you slimed it. In the digital world, we now compare notes with players worldwide. Are the books frustrating? I only ever played one book straight through without being killed off, the first sorcery book, and even that wasn't easy. I suspect, as the first book in the series, it was made easier to get through no matter the branches you clambered over. Maybe I was just lucky, though. The later books in the series were a wee bit tougher. By that I mean turn to 666 to read a paragraph full of sweary ranting.